the rescue. So Tom, why is this topic so important?
Kevin, it's a really important word, I think, when we think about the gap we feel between the life we long to live and the life we live. All of us long for a life of meaning and purpose and joy, and we wrestle with this lack of coherence in our life. And so we need to be rescued.
Yeah, that's so true. Tim, maybe add in there a little bit. How have you felt the effects of the gap?
Yeah, so I remember being an early Christian and probably did something wrong either to my parents or to a friend, and them telling me that the reason for my guilt and shame comes from this story in Genesis 3. And so I went there and I read it, and it was a story about this tree in a garden and God telling Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree. And of course they do eat from the tree. And because they eat from the tree, now I have this guilt and shame for what I did wrong to these other people, and thinking, really? That doesn't seem to just give an explanation for why I feel the way I feel.
Mm-hmm. This gap is real, though. I mean, and I think we feel it.
We do.
So Tom, talk with us a little bit of that. How does Christianity respond to this? What's Christianity's answer to the reality of this gap?
Well, Christianity is a marvelous story, isn't it? I mean, when we think about the very beginning of this story, we need to start in Genesis 1 and 2. And in Genesis 1 and 2, we see this beautiful design of an integral God who's relational. He creates this integral creation that we're a part of, relationally, knowing Him, knowing one another, knowing creation. And it's a beautiful picture of this longing for coherence and meaning and joy and abundance. But what happens in Genesis 3? You know, the story changes massively. And we have this massive disintegration of our relationship with God and relationship with others, with creation, and the ripping apart of our coherence and our sense of meaning. So we do need to be rescued because of this grand tragedy in Genesis 3.
Sometimes that disintegration is referred to as sin. We use that term to describe it, and often misunderstood, or it's confusing. So help us out a little bit. How do you define that? How do we talk about it? I don't know if we want to, let's make you our sin expert at the table.
I am a sin expert, because I've been sinning longer than you guys, I think.
Very true. Yeah, I like that. How do you define sin?
Yeah, and the word sin, has some baggage, doesn't it? I mean, it's a very churchy word. We don't usually use that in everyday conversation, but it's a really important idea. Because in the biblical story, sin is not just something we do. I mean, all of us fall short, right, in our morals or whatever. We all make mistakes. And we often think of sin as a choice we make that's wrong. And that's certainly part of it. But the biblical story is more that sin is who we are. It's affected our nature and our rebellion against God and this disruption of our relationship with God, with creation, with others. So sin is a nature, is it not, that we possess, not just a moral construct of what we do.
And there's so many effects of sin. I mean, we feel it. We feel it around us. Talk a little bit about that, Tim. What are some ways that we feel the effects of sin?
Yeah, so over time, the Genesis 3 story began to make sense to me. I mean, the initial confusion.
Good, you're a pastor now.
I am, it got worked out. And the big thing was that at the heart of that sin, at the heart of that failure was that Adam and Eve didn't trust God. They thought they knew how to live their life better than God knew how to live their life. And so the result of that was then they go from harmony and living together, being in relationship to one another, walking with God in the garden, to hiding, feeling their nakedness and their shame, and hiding from one another, blaming one another. That Adam blames Eve. Adam even sort of blames God for putting Eve there. Eve blames the serpent, and there's just blame, there's guilt, there's shame. And we all feel that even today, right? We feel that as parents when we're trying to love our kids, and we feel like we could always be doing more, or we feel that in our jobs, where we feel like we could give more, or we could produce more, and we're just not able to live up to that. That we feel that guilt and shame everywhere.
And yet in Genesis 3, even there's a little glimpse of hope, isn't there?
Yeah, there's these two great moments especially. The one is, so Adam and Eve, they're hiding and they're in shame, and they cover themselves with fig leaves, which just seems silly to us. And yet that's a sign that they felt that shame. They felt that guilt. They're trying to cover their nakedness, their shame. So God comes in, He clothes them. He gives them clothing to wear to cover their guilt, their shame. And then the second moment, my favorite moment, is God speaks to the serpent who had talked them into sinning against God, who had talked them into not trusting God. And God says to that serpent that there's a day coming when a son is going to descend from this woman Eve and is going to come, and he's going to destroy you. He's going to kill you. He's going to consign you to judgment. And all the disharmony that you've entered into the world, all the relational breakdown between one another, between human beings, between us and God, all of that's going to be gone because that Son is going to take care of you, the serpent. And that moment just reminds us this rescue begins right at the moment of the fall, right at the moment when sin introduces. God already has a rescue plan in place.
And one thing I love about this is that I don't love it, I guess, but in Genesis 3, not only is relational disharmony evident, but our very creative ability to work with our hands, that our work itself is profoundly disintegrated because we long to contribute in the world. And so part of the effects of sin is that our work is all messed up.
Tim, I know you've been important, really a key leader for us in putting this Life We Long to Live series together. Help us understand in this session, and maybe even how it all stitches together, what's something you want to make sure that people don't miss?
Yeah, I think the big thing is right where Tom started, is there's this gap between where we're at and where we're living and what we long to live and experience. And the only way over that gap is for God to come and rescue us. That we're like Adam and Eve, we're hiding and in shame, filled with guilt in so many different experiences of life. And the only way we're coming out of that is for God to enter our world and to rescue us. And that's what we see. I mean, that's the story of the cross. It's the story of the rescue of what God has initiated through Jesus, that he comes through the incarnation to meet us where we are and to go to his cross, be crucified through the crucifixion on our behalf. And not just to die for us, not just to cover the penalty of our sin, but actually to overcome death itself in the resurrection and to give us hope of new life. And that doesn't just mean new life in the life to come, but new life now. We can defeat sin. We can, in the guilt and shame we experience now, we can be freed from that in some sense into new life. And that even beyond just that, God's not just saving us individually, he's saving all of this creation. And that there's a kingdom breaking in that Jesus initiates that's gonna make all things new and make everything right. And so if anyone could hear anything from this start, is that there's a rescue plan that began back in the garden and is continued on into eternity.
You know, that's such a hopeful story, isn't it? When you think about how our lives are so difficult now and how broken they are. And isn't it amazing as we think about the cross, that the cross literally bridges this gap between the life we long to live and the life we live. And that is very hopeful.